Right. I'm Liz Ford and I'm the Deputy Editor of the Guardian's Global Development site. And I also have a special interest in women's rights, and I'm going to make a shameless plug for our women's rights section that launched in February. If you go to the Global Development site, there should be a link to the women's rights section. And obviously if you have any ideas, then please email us or come and see me afterwards. So I just want to welcome the panel. They're all from the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, and they're going to be discussing a bit about the work they do in protecting women and girls around the world. Now 2014, 2015, they're providing some significant anniversaries in the history of, in the women's rights movement. And I think they provide a fitting opportunity for us to sort of pause and sort of reflect on what we've done so far and what still needs to, the road that still needs to be travelled. 20 years ago this year was the Cairo Agreements, where more than 170 countries signed a platform of action, which was seen as a landmark at the time. And obviously there have been some anniversary events this year that are kind of highlighting the fact that a lot of those pledges haven't actually been kept, and there are some issues. And then next year we've got the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action. We've also got the 15th anniversary since the Security Council, UN Security Council 1325, which really kind of put women in conflict, peace, reconciliation. So there'll be events sort of marking that. And then of course we're all waiting to see what's going to be in our new set of Sustainable Development Goals. So we're going to be having hopefully a draft to look at that in September at the UNGA, and then obviously next year is when it gets sort of down and dirty in the detail. So some shiny new goals for 2016. So there's lots happening, and I think these kind of this year, next year is quite a significant time for us to think. So I think I was talking to Liesl last week about this event and some of the things we want to talk about, and I think she was very keen that we do highlight and look at progress that we made, because we have come a long way in 20 years. And yes, there are still challenges and there will be things that we need to look towards, but it's kind of probably trying to get those positive news stories in a sense. And I'm a journalist, so I kind of know that we are portrayed sometimes as just looking at the negative, and I like to say that I really do try and get the positive stories as much as possible. So it'd be really good to kind of hear some of those stories tonight. So I'm going to introduce you to the panel. Without further ado, so I have Liesl Gerntholtz. She is the Director of the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. At the end, we have Sama Muscati, who is Researcher for Women's Rights in Emergencies. We have Rosna Begum, is a Researcher for Women's Rights in MENA, which is the Middle East.
North Africa.
Middle East, North Africa. Threw me for a minute. It's acronyms. I should know that one by now. We have Agnes Athiambo, who is a researcher for women's rights in Africa, and Gary Van Gulik is the Global Advocate in the Women's Rights Division. So welcome to you all. And so the format we're going to take is we're going to hear from each of the panellists. They're going to talk for about 5 minutes or so. And then we might sort of have a little discussion, and then we're going to open up for questions, because I think it'd be really good to get a discussion going and to get some questions and try and pick the brains of the experts really that are up here. So Liesl, shall we start with you?
Thanks, Liz, and thank you to all of you who've come out on a not rainy evening in London. We're particularly grateful that you've chosen to spend it with us indoors. In interviewing victims about human rights violations, you don't hear the good stories. You hear really about often the most traumatic and difficult periods of people's lives. So, we do this work in 90 different countries. We look at a range of geographical and thematic issues. We have a children's rights division, we have a health and human rights division, we have an arms division, and really what we try to do is to create the most accurate picture of what is going on in the ground as we can. We pay a lot of attention to accuracy, to making sure that we're able to corroborate evidence, and we use that evidence then to try and persuade high-level policymakers to do something about it. In very simple terms, that's what everybody at Human Rights Watch is trying to do, is use good information. I think we believe, perhaps naively, that if you can just get the information in front of the right people, that of course they'll want to stop what's going on in the ground. And sometimes they do, sometimes not so much. And I said very specifically to Liz when we talked, I did think it was important to pause for a moment and look at the progress that has been made in women's rights. Because I think, particularly in women's rights, those of us who work have to be willing to play the long game, because change is always incremental. There's very little that I have done, both in my life before Human Rights Watch and during my employment at Human Rights Watch, that has been susceptible to overnight change or one Human Rights Watch report or one press release. So it's very important that we are willing to play the long game and to invest significant time in advocacy and research. But that also means that sometimes we really miss the fact that all of this has had a very important impact in changing the lives, really, of women and girls on the ground. And I want to highlight two things that I think are very important. One is the recognition of violence against women as a human rights violation. In 1993, at a conference in Vienna, women who attended that conference were incredibly well organized, in fact, more organized than anybody else at that conference, namely the men. And they had undertaken a long process of consultation in the regions. They had been very strategic in their advocacy in building alliances, both cross-regionally but also with key governments. It is the place where the phrase women's rights are human rights, Hillary Clinton did not invent that. But the upshot of that was a recognition by the 193 countries that signed the Vienna Declaration that violence against women, and in particular domestic violence, violence that happens in the places where women should be the safest, was a human rights violation, and therefore that governments had an obligation to address it, prevent it, respond to it. And in a relatively short period of time, you have seen almost every country in the world, most recently Saudi Arabia, developing laws that criminalize aspects of domestic and sexual violence. And I think that's a very significant achievement, because if you think about, I think it's significant that we're here in London because just over 40 years ago, the first women's shelter was opened by the Chiswick Women's Aid. And they opened it at a time when very few people knew what a shelter was, what it should look like. And of course, it has been very influential in shaping other responses to domestic violence. So we have seen very significant progress in national standard setting and in global standard setting around violence against women. The challenge is, of course, as it always is to implement those laws and to make sure that women can benefit from them. But I think the very fact that we have been able to get them in place is something that we need to celebrate and that we need to be really pleased about. The second thing I want to raise is maternal mortality. Women who die from preventable death as a result of pregnancy, childbirth, and in the 6 weeks after they've delivered. This has been largely seen as a public health issue, as a development issue. But the human rights dimension has been incredibly important in understanding who dies and why they die. Because even in countries that have made significant progress in improving their maternal mortality ratio, there have been very particular groups of women who haven't benefited from these interventions. And they are generally women who experience a range of human rights violations anyway. So they are women who are marginalized. They are women who are discriminated against. And unless we begin to remove those human rights barriers, the improvements that we've seen will not be available to all women. And I think the progress that we have made, and this is really recent progress, it is only in the last 5 years that the world has begun to recognize that we need to address the human rights dimension of preventable maternal death. We have seen the Human Rights Council in Geneva come together to adopt a number of resolutions recognizing that we need to remove the human rights violations that prevent us from making sure that all women can be safely pregnant and deliver their babies. And we have begun to see progress made in addressing one of the Millennium Development Goals, which is to reduce the number of preventable maternal deaths. So these are two, I think, really significant, quite different issues that I think, for me, demonstrate kind of two things. One, that we can address these issues. And I speak from the perspective of a South African who, lived in the height of apartheid, but also lived to see Nelson Mandela walk out of prison. So I think change is always possible. And I think the second thing it demonstrates is that even in cases where we believe we've made progress, we need to keep an eye on the women who are invisible, the women who are vulnerable, the women that often are not the most important, who don't always have a voice. Because even when we are able to deliver human rights benefits to many people, we still need to be sure that we are able to deliver those benefits to everybody. So I'm going to stop now, and I think my colleagues are going to tell you less of the good news stories than I am. But I hope that you will think, you will think about the progress that we have made, and that we will be encouraged to continue to make progress as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Liesl. And I think what you said about the long game, it might be interesting to come back to that about how long do you think the long game is? But I think that's really important points. Bothno, shall I come to you next?
Sure. I guess I'd like to, because I work in the Middle East and North Africa, it's the region where a lot of people have concentrated on how do we move on for women's rights here, where the region has been in revolt, and there's now opportunities for women. Are those rights being protected? So here I'm going to talk about Yemen as a case example. So Yemen is a country where, before 2011, it's where discrimination against women was entrenched in both law and practice. It's a country where the constitution said that women were sisters of men. And the personal status law, which covers family, marriage, and divorce, actually has an article talking about how a woman has to be obedient towards her husband and defines what obedience is, including, for instance, that she should allow her husband to have sex when he demands it, that she needs to do the work in the home in the manner of her peers, and that she's not allowed outside of the home without his permission except in certain circumstances. So legally speaking, she's in a second-class status. Beyond that, culturally and in practice, she faces a number of different restrictions. One of the key issues that Human Rights Watch documented was child marriage. So women in Yemen in 2006, statistics showed that about half the women were married under the age of 18, and about 14% of them were married under the age of 15. And that's because the personal status law provides no minimum age of marriage for girls. It actually says a father can marry off his daughter, and in the case of where a man has married her, he cannot consummate the marriage until she has reached puberty, and even if that means she's 15. So all that really means is she can be as young as 2 years old, it doesn't matter, she can be married off by her father. And as a result, child marriage had been on the increase, and Human Rights Watch went in and documented the kind of horrors that child marriage caused young girls, including girls as young as 8 who were married to men as old as 35 or 40. And when 2011 came along and Yemen went through an uprising and President Saleh initially went on and went out of power, the report was released, which basically said we need to sort of move on and really change the situation for women, particularly looking at child marriage here. And things took shape after that. So transitional government came into place, and child marriage became more of an issue that people started to really take up. And we went back in again to do more advocacy because there was an opportunity in Yemen that had come about, which was called the National Dialogue. So it wasn't just the transitional authorities, but the government in place had decided that they needed to sort of have a representation in society that would allow for the country to move forward. So a national dialogue was formed, representing about 30% of which were women, youth, people from the north and the south, from different tribes. And they were to come and build the blocks for a constitution, a new constitution, as well as for reforming laws and policies. So really taking on all of your country's problems in this one forum. And we went back there and we basically talked to them about the kind of provisions we wanted to see in the Constitution that would really protect and promote women's rights for years to come, for generations to come. Because as we had seen, the previous laws and Constitution had really degraded women to a second-class status. So we wanted to be in a position that, if not now, but in 10, 20 years' time, we would see a much, much bigger change. So we asked for an equality provision, a non-discrimination provision, and a provision against violence against women. And it also looked at the laws and policies in place that really discriminate against women, one of which was child marriage. Calling in particular for the age of marriage to be set at 18 and for criminalization. So for those who partake in this activity, such as their parents or registrars or even the men who marry these young girls, to be punished or prosecuted for such acts. when we went in at the time, you know, it's a very challenging environment. You know, it's one of the most conservative environments you can work in. You know, the Rights and Freedoms Committee, who were looking at human rights issues within the National Dialogue, they were experiencing a lot of problems with the different far right wing of those in the political parties, including from women who were far right wing as well. And the person leading the Rights and Freedoms Committee was herself a woman. Not only was she a woman who didn't wear a headscarf, which in Yemen is actually very uncommon. And she was leading a group of people, including men who were very far right and who actually were unable to even look at her. And in the end, you know, we had given them this letter and had helped with the recommendations and so on. They were able to pass some very good provisions, including a minimum age setting 18 as a minimum age of marriage. Now, Yemen is a real case of showing where we are now at progress levels. So not only have we now had this recommendation from the National Dialogue, we have a Child Rights Act, which includes setting minimum age of marriage at 18 and criminalizing those who take part in this, as well as criminalizing FGM. And that Child Rights Act has now been put to Cabinet, which we are now pressuring on them to pass this and send it to Parliament and for them to pass this. But we are also looking at the Constitution. So now that those recommendations have been passed regarding constitutional provisions, the Constitutional Drafting Assembly is about to be set up, and they will have about a year to spend to look at the Constitution, and we will go back again and really try and pressure them to have the Constitution provisions that we want to really see in there to protect women's rights. Now, I'm just going to leave you with one story that really not only provoked international outcry, but also local outcry in Yemen that really heightened the discourse around child marriage around the time when we actually got the recommendation passed. And it was of a girl called Rawan. So around in September of last year, a story appeared in the news of an 8-year-old girl who had been married after a man about 5 times her age. And she passed away. She died from internal bleeding 3 days after her wedding night. And that story really sparked not just what was ongoing movement against child marriage, but both in the international arena where we were putting a lot of pressure on the international community to speak about child marriage, but also internally where the country itself, where people were divided over the issue. You know, people, they don't want to be seeing 8-year-old girls dying after the wedding night by 40-year-old men. This is not a Yemeni issue at the end of the day. The fact was there was a law that completely did not provide for a minimum age of marriage, that they were really failing the girls in Yemen, and that these girls, whether or not they were dying, there were still a lot of problems that were ongoing and that caused lasting, harmful consequences later on. So with Yemen, I think we see real hope that, you know, if we do get a constitution in, at some point in the future, we can now be moving on from what is a very entrenched discrimination against women.
Great, so positive noises for Yemen, that sounds great. And we were actually talking...
out, you know, would challenge sectarianism, would challenge misogyny, would challenge these horrible things that they're faced with on a day-to-day basis. And no matter, you know, how dangerous the work is for us, it's, you know, 10 times, 100 times more dangerous for women and for other activists on the ground in these countries. At the end of the day, we can always leave and come back to for the most part, our respective countries. But for the women who are fighting the fight, you know, on the ground, unfortunately, they have nowhere to go to at the end of the day, and you know, and they face the communities that they're trying to change. So it is inspiring to see these women, and for me, it really motivates me to do the work that I do when I'm there and being part of this wonderful movement. In a place like Iraq, one of the big challenges is that, you know, Iraq used to be a leader in women's rights in the region for so long in terms of employment, education, women's literacy, health, all these issues. Iraq was a benchmark country, even in personal status matters. And to see what has happened over the past 20 years, especially over the past 10 years since the invasion of Iraq, it's heartbreaking because it makes you realize how fragile women's rights particularly are in post-conflict and conflict countries, and how women often become, you know, the most marginalized population in these types of conflicts. Where right now there's a bill that has been passed by the Council of Ministers. It's in Parliament, and it allows girls as young as 9 to get married in Iraq. This is happening now. This is not, you know, 50 years ago. When in fact there are strong provisions in the personal status law of Iraq that previously limited girls from getting married at such a young age. But there's a range of issues. I mean, you look at women in public spaces in Iraq, even though the Constitution, sets forth, a quota of women who should be in parliament. The truth is that the space for women in Iraq has shrunk considerably because of threats from militias, because of religious extremism, all these issues that have sort of taken root in the country. And the range of issues that Iraq is dealing with for women in particular are enormous. So that's one of the challenges that we see in other countries as well. I mean, in Somalia right now, where I did my most recent work and where I'm continuing to do work, it's because of the conflict, we see rape and sexual violence as an everyday fact of life for women and girls in places like Mogadishu. And the fact that women are victimized twice, once by the actual rape and the second time by the fact that they aren't able to access any types of services really or legal redress from governments and from, so they're on their own. And one of the positives, I guess, is that the international community is aware and has worked with Somalia to develop, joint commitments that Somalia has to sort of work toward. The trick now and the challenge is trying to make sure that those commitments are met. And I think, in places like Somalia where there has been such a long history of conflict and strife that has stripped the institutions to the bare, there is really an important role for the international community to play, especially when the government is open and willing to engage and needs help and asks for help. I think there's a real opportunity there for countries like the UK and other countries to step in. So those are some of the challenges and progress that I've seen working in the Women's Rights Division.
I think it's really fascinating you talking about the women that you've met and that are inspiring. And the best part of my job, hands down, is actually I get the chance to speak to women who are just getting on, and that's just the best thing you can do is just hear from them and find out what they're doing. Forget the politics side of things, but just speak to them. Agnes.
Yeah. Thank you, Liz. I remember when we heard about this event, actually amongst us, we were all debating, what am I going to talk about? What have we achieved? So I guess sometimes we get so immersed into documenting the problems and trying to see change that we don't even ourselves pause to actually think about what really have we achieved. So thank you so much. I think this is a great opportunity to get us to reflect a little bit. I'm sure we all know about the abduction of the Nigerian girls. It's been on the media. I think I'm almost calling it an obsession because I'm like, why is this thing so big? I mean, it's great that, the whole world really is concerned. We all want to see these girls come home. In Nigeria, there's been amazing activism from communities, from parents, calling for the government to hold. One day, you start having sex with him, you get pregnant, you're 13 years old, you need to cook, go to the garden to force sisters. We all love motherhood, we all celebrate mothers. But behind the scenes, what is this girl going? 20-year-old man. And every time he would come into the bedroom, she would just faint. The shock of it, she would just faint. Electric fistula. Too young to be able to go through a pregnancy and childbirth. And so these girls get deprivation in their own families. But I think there has been a lot of the most invisible girls that are in rural areas, girls that are very poor, and girls that have got very little education. And so whenever we talk about progress, I always say that, yes, there is progress, but when you actually go on the ground, there are a lot of inequalities, and that is what we need to tackle. Even in the area of maternal health that Liesl was talking about, we've seen a lot of progress, but when you go on the ground, there are a lot of inequalities. It's those women who cannot speak for themselves who are the most affected, and I think those are the things that we really need to look at. Who are we leaving behind? I think that's the question we need to be asking, because as we move forward, there are a lot of people that we are leaving behind. One positive also around child marriage, again, relates to what actually Sama was saying, that even in the context of, emergencies and conflict, you find a lot of very brave women who come forward and who stand up and really want to make a change. And we are seeing the same with these girls. Girls' agency, I think for me, is a very positive thing. In many countries, we are having girls who are standing up, who are assisting these marriages. They do so at a very high risk, where sometimes they are murdered by their families for refusing a forced marriage, but they are standing up and they are saying, we want the government to respect us. We want our voice to be heard. And so my message today is, let's not leave any woman behind. Let's not leave any girl behind. And definitely, let's really amplify those voices, those ones that are really standing up for themselves. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that whole issue about invisible women and left behind, I think that's a key thing. And let's see if they actually come up when these summits happen over the summer. Gary, to you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks. I mean, one of the pleasures that I have in working in Human Rights Watch is to work with these great colleagues. It's actually a pleasure to share the stage and to hear all these stories again. As Agnes says, we very rarely have time for this kind of reflection. It's actually a pleasure to hear my colleagues. And I thought it would be good to talk to you at the end of this a little bit about the opportunities that exist today. I think it's an exciting time for many reasons. And Liz mentioned a few of these big processes that are happening, big moments, big anniversaries. But I think there's a couple of relatively unknown processes happening right now that we believe can really change lives of millions of girls and women around the world. And it requires a lot of technical, hard, difficult work. But I think that we can achieve a lot with this. So I wanted to highlight two of these. One of them is a process that is currently undergoing in Geneva, and it is on forced labor. One of the main core parts of international law is the International Labour Organization's Treaty on Forced Labor, but it's horribly outdated. It's from '38. It pretty much says, go ahead, use forced labor as long as, they're 18 and over and able-bodied and healthy enough. It was meant for the colonial days and just completely irrelevant in many ways. It did set, however, the standard of what is forced labor. What's the definition? And the fact that countries do have to criminalize it in principle. Now, what's happening now is all governments around the world, together with trade unions, workers' organizations, and employer organizations, hatching out an update of this treaty. And you've heard a lot probably about trafficking, sex trafficking, modern-day slavery, whatever it's called, here in the UK and elsewhere. But the vast majority of cases of forced labor are actually in other fields of labor. So not the sex slavery, the sex trafficking, but actually in other areas, including a field where we've done a lot of research, and my colleagues have been documenting abuses in this area for over a decade, which is domestic workers, workers who work in households, and mainly migrant domestic workers. So we are very concerned about this group. We are concerned about all victims of forced labor, of course, but we feel that there's not enough attention for particularly this field. And we are keen to see these negotiations through. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this, as technical as it sounds, is that we believe some guidance from these negotiations, some agreement internationally that we don't accept any form of forced labor, that there are many ways to prevent it, explaining how, making sure that governments have a strong set of basic laws to end this, to prosecute this, to prevent it, will have an enormous impact ultimately on the lives of women and girls. The reason I mention it here is because the United Kingdom actually is playing a fairly negative role, unfortunately. We hear a lot on the one hand from Theresa May and others about how they want to end modern-day slavery. But, for example, in these negotiations, in this important moment, the United Kingdom is saying, we don't want binding standards. We just want a recommendation. We want guidelines, which is extremely negative. So I wanted to highlight that because there's actually a lot of work to do in the United Kingdom when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to the United Kingdom's work around the world on issues of women's rights. And that is really a key challenge. So in this important time, when we do this important work on forced labor, it's actually striking how unhelpful the United Kingdom is in this field. So I think that's an interesting dilemma where you have a lot of good language on the one hand, but we know in these kind of difficult negotiations what's really happening. And so that's one interesting example, I think, and an exciting time, a good opportunity to achieve some change, hopefully. And the second example is something that Liesl mentioned in the beginning, the issue of domestic violence. You know, I think here in Europe, well, I mean, pretty much every single country has a basic provision that criminalizes domestic violence. You know, there are basic standards in place. And so a couple of years ago, the Council of Europe, the body that sort of rules over 47 countries, as they would like to see it, but that 47 member states, has decided to start looking at what's the next level. How can we develop a much more detailed set of standards that looks at prevention of domestic violence, that looks at gaps, as Agnes was saying, is the same in the field of child marriage, domestic violence as well. We've seen in countries like Belgium, in Hungary, in Turkey, that there are certain groups of women that are left out. So even though you have basic provisions that say, you know, it's criminalized, for example, undocumented women might not be able to go to the police or get any help that they need. In Turkey, the example was unmarried women won't be able to get help or protection orders. And in Hungary, we saw issues around women with children, how if you have children, that child protection services will take away the child automatically in some cases, which of course hampers their access to protection. And if you're single, and you've been abused by your ex-boyfriend, you don't have a chance of getting any help. So these gaps are significant. And basically we saw the development of I would say, probably the strongest, most progressive standard internationally for this region, for Europe, called the Istanbul Convention. It was signed in Istanbul in the end. And we are quite excited this year because we saw the 10th ratification of this convention, which means it's legally binding now in those countries that ratify it. Again, the United Kingdom has signed it, but hasn't ratified it yet, which means it's not actually legally binding yet in the United Kingdom. So I want everyone to know that, to please, you know, I would say write to your MP, but again, this is again a field where the United Kingdom was very difficult in negotiations. It's very strong normally about domestic violence, and it is an example in quite a lot of ways. But again, internationally, doesn't quite stand up when it's time to really put their weight and show the example that they have at home. So I think that's another interesting example where I'm hopeful, and I think we're seeing progress. We're seeing a more in-depth discussion of this issue. We're sort of building on that success and moving forward, and I hope that this will be widespread and ratified everywhere in the region, and hopefully will lead to actual changes and leave no woman behind, as Agnes was saying, also in the field of domestic violence. Thanks.
Great. I mean, that's brilliant. Thank you for highlighting the issues of the UK and the rest of Europe, because so often we look at these things as in global south versus global north. Global north has it all sorted, and obviously we all know that is not the case. So I think that's really important. So thank you for bringing that in. So I hope the speakers have sort of churned up some ideas and some thoughts in you, and you've got lots of questions to ask. I'm just going to quickly jump in and ask a couple, if I may. And one of them is there seems to be a real, we've looked at 20 years, we've thought about significant moments, but there just seems to have been a real kind of, just on that, I mean, I've been to a few events now, but certainly the last two UN Commission on the Status of Women events, been such a blatant pushback. It's just amazing to actually sit and watch these discussions. So just say it's very fragile. So are we saying that there's been this sort of groundswell and this top-down movement, and that's kind of pushed, I don't know, the more conservative, governments or leaders to sort of push back? I mean, is that a natural kind of thing that's going to happen anyway, and it's just another thing that women's rights activists are going to have to deal with, or?
I mean, I'm going to lean back. I'm not going to lean in. But I mean, I think, Rosna also works at the sharp end of that discussion, because I think she works in a region where these debates are playing themselves out in a very live way.
Sure. Sure. I mean, in the Middle East and North Africa, there's always that fight, you know, do we defend what we have right now or do we push for more? Because half the time you're defending your rights. And we've seen that in places like Tunisia where, you know, where there were gains for women's rights issues, where really women's rights activists were very advanced and they'd had a lot of rights that they'd really, you know, got a hold of. But, you know, there was a huge amount of regression going on, a huge amount of would be only for this one community, which means that only this one community, these girls would have less rights than the current setting of standards, meaning that the other communities could also regress. And, you know, that's something like Lebanon has, for instance. Lebanon doesn't have a civil status code, so it actually only has about 15 personal status laws, all of which discriminate against women. So they have a great common theme in all pushing back on women. And I think it will always be the case that we will have that fight, that we will have, at one point decide that we're going to have to stand and push back. And other times when we are just about okay, we can keep pushing forward, because otherwise you will never get anywhere.
Yeah, can I just add something to that actually, because I think it goes again to what Liesl was saying, that you really have to be in it for the long term. You know, sometimes when you do this work and you release a report and the following day someone is asking you to, what's the impact of this work? What have you really achieved? And you're like, and you meet them the following year, you released that report last year, what impact? And you're like, so you really have to be in it for the long term. And I think that's one of the things that really makes me very proud about working in the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch, because we do these things for the long term. I mean, my colleague Nisha Varia worked on domestic workers for over 10 years, and now at least we have a lot to celebrate. So these things don't come overnight, and actually once you achieve something, as Frontline is saying, you cannot, you know, we celebrate, but that can quickly also be taken away. I mean, I remember in my own country, in Kenya, the other day, we have really been fighting to have a marriage law that's very comprehensive. And then what do we get from our parliamentarians? They legalize polygamy. A woman can share their husband's debts, but not the property. But, you know, there are other positive provisions in the law. So you celebrate what you can get, what you get, as you keep pushing for change on these other areas. So it's really not easy. Sometimes, that's why we were saying that sometimes even becomes very difficult to think about what have we really achieved, because you're getting something today, 5 months down the line, the parliament is changing the law again and bringing in the very same, you know, regressive provisions. But, you know, we really have seen some consistent change on some of these issues. And so we celebrate what we can get. But the point is that it has to be the long term. Yeah.
I had a very interesting conversation with a Kenyan MP recently, so I'd like to, I might have a discussion with you afterwards to compare notes on what he was saying. He had a different take on it. So we talk about, you say, the long term. How does that tie in with donors then, who don't really want the long term? They want the short, value for money, snappy show. That seems to be an issue. It seems to jar with most things. How do we get around that? Is that lobbying Justine Greening to say you need to change how DFID works?
I think yes and no, because I think that you have seen some donor governments, and I think about issues on reproductive rights particularly. I think you have seen some governments who have made very long-term investments in funding programs, you know, from really thinking about how you give contraception to women who want it, to funding programs for safe abortion, to funding programs around adolescent sexuality. So I think there have been donors who have been willing to make that kind of commitment. I think the concern for us is that every year there's some kind of new shiny thing, child marriage, sexual violence and conflict, when really what I think is at the root of all of this is women's inequality. And that addressing sexual violence, as important as that is addressing it in conflict, you know, you really have to address the root causes of that. So I think that's where we struggle sometimes, is that, you know, especially, and I think about working locally in South Africa, you know, I went from working in a place where violence against women was incredibly important, and we couldn't spend the money that donors were throwing at us, to being told that everything was related to HIV, to being told that everything is now related to empowering men and boys to take up women's equality. And every time, I mean, and I work for small and big organizations, and I think the challenge for an organization like Human Rights Watch, I think we're in a difficult position, in a different position, and I think we have a better ability to work with donors and to help jointly shape priorities. But for those smaller grassroots organizations that are so critical, that so significantly disrupts their ability to do sustain consistent, meaningful work, to have impact, because I think as much as we're asked, like, what have you done, you know, they're asked in a year, so have you stopped HIV amongst women in South Africa? Why is there still rape going on? We gave you $100,000. So I think that is a very important question, and I think not so much for the big international organizations, but for those groups that are so critical. You know, it is so critical at so many levels to have strong local groups. And they really struggle. I mean, they're constantly having to shift their priorities depending on what is the new shiny issue that donors want to work on. I mean, you know, it's all men and boys now.
Yes, I've heard that. Yeah. Got press releases about that only this week. Yeah, it's very exciting. So we're going to throw it open to questions, and I saw a hand go straight up there, so I'm going to... Yes. I've got a mic. Perfect.
No. Right to the back, Ellie.
We've heard a lot about violence to young ladies, girls, child marriage, etc., young women. We've not heard anything about the elderly and old ladies, and I recognise as well the audience here, we're a very young demographic, and I just wonder, is that because actually once one's made it through life, one's got to the other end as an elderly lady, you're actually safe now and you're okay, or is it because they don't have a voice and no one's hearing about it? Because to me, age is a real concern, and I don't think we hear enough about it.
Maybe we'll take another couple of questions and then that's it.
Thank you for your talk. I am a gender and disability rights activist from India. And my question to the panel is that when you speak about missing women and the women who we should consider, has Human Rights Watch, or have you seen that within the women's rights space, has there been a consideration for women with disabilities? Because when we're talking about sexual violence and abuse and domestic violence, it just goes to another level where the perpetrators could be the caregivers, the families. There are no really support systems. So I'd like to know if Human Rights Watch has done work on this, or have you seen progress in this arena? Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we saw a lot of progress with the integration of human rights laws in different countries, especially in the north and in the south also. However, when we want to reach those girls and women that are really that going through a lot of violence, in those communities, it's not modern laws and human rights that actually are regulating the everyday life, but it's really traditional laws. So I would like to know, and very often in those communities, human rights is a foreign concept that they're not taking so much into consideration. And I would like to know, how do you do to actually link those two bodies of laws to have more impact for those girls and women you're trying to protect?
Great question. So looking at the elderly, people with disabilities, and this whole, bridging traditional and human rights laws. So I don't know who wants to... Okay, so I'll come to you.
Okay, I'll take the one on the elderly women. We do include all women in the work that we do. When we document these abuses, other than, even actually when we do work on child marriage, we do interview older women who are married as children just to hear what have been their experiences over the years. And then when we do work around sexual violence, we still interview elderly women. But looking at specifically what kind of challenges the very elderly women may be having, that's not something we've done, but actually it's a conversation that we have started having within the division. Recently, I was in Tanzania with a colleague of mine looking at the issue of child marriage, and we kept hearing about the killing of elderly women. And then when you do a little bit of investigation, because we always try to investigate something that we find interesting, even if that was not your agenda there, is that these women actually killed because of property. most likely their husbands have died, they're widows. And so because other males, brothers or uncles or brothers-in-laws want to dispossess them of their property, then they accuse them of witchcraft, and so they kill them. And there's absolutely no follow-up by the government. This is something that we've been hearing a lot in West Africa. Again, women being murdered under the guise of them being witches. Again, very much linked to property, land, and all of that. But there's also the issue of reproductive rights of elder women, because, you know, I remember in South Africa, I was speaking with someone who was doing some work with elder women, and she was saying when it comes to sexual and reproductive health, there are a lot of challenges, because when they go to doctors or nurses and they are having all these issues, or they want contraception, there's a lot of stigma. Where are you still having sex in your 60s? So yeah, thank you for that question. It's something that we are considering, and if you speak to me in the next 2 years, I'll be having a project on that.
Yeah, I'd love to address the issue of disability. It's actually a major priority for Human Rights Watch. We're very proud to have just established a disability rights program in Human Rights Watch, and we have worked specifically on the specific impact, sort of the coming together of women's rights issues and disability in many fields. So in the area of violence, we did a report in Uganda on domestic violence against women with disabilities. We've done work in Peru, for example, on reproductive rights and the impact on women with disabilities. But also just to say, I mean, when I was doing research in Turkey on domestic violence, I remember talking to every single shelter that we could find, and every time asking, do you have any facilities for women with physical disabilities, and do you allow women with mental disabilities to actually enter the shelters? And the answer was no every single time, and this is still a major gap, and we recognize that. And I just wanted to say thank you for raising that here as well.
And Sama, I don't know whether you want to come in to talk about these from your perspective.
Yeah, no, I think the traditional versus, I guess, the legal systems is a very interesting question, one that we grapple with, because obviously, you know, it's important that countries live up to their international commitments and make sure that their penal codes and other legislation conform with international law. I think that's definitely one way to approach it, and this is what we do regularly in terms of our analysis. And you'll see from our reports, you know, for instance, in Somalia, we criticize the penal code because there's gaps in that protects perpetrators of violence and sexual violence. But at the same time, you know, there's this whole other issue of traditional law and customs that needs to be addressed. And it's something that we've tackled before in creative ways. For instance, the Women's Rights Division did a report on female genital mutilation in northern Iraq. We released a report in 2010, and obviously, you know, we wanted to make sure that the laws were changed in northern Iraq, which in fact were changed about a year after we released our report with intense advocacy on our parts. But at the same time, we realized that this is a custom that's been going on for generations. And I was there as well to do some of the research, and I met with the women, you know, as grandmothers who have done this, and it's who have had this done to them when they were younger, and it's passed on along the generations. And so practice is actually mostly done by women. It's the mothers and the sisters who you know, hold down the girl when she's being cut, and then it's done by a female midwife. So the idea is how do we challenge that more from just a legal perspective? And one way was we approached the Kurdish Islamic scholars, and I think because of those efforts, they issued a fatwa saying that FGM is not an Islamic practice per se. And I think that should have enormous impact, because you know, when you're looking at these practices, they're not going to end in a couple of years. It is, as my colleagues have been saying, it's the long game that we have to play. And one way to do that is try to actually, you know, challenge people's fundamental beliefs in terms of what they should be doing and what they should not be doing. So that's one way that we've approached that.
Rosalind, do you want to come in there on sort of the research that you've been doing in the areas you work in, specifically on that, you know, any of the points actually, but sort of the traditional versus...
Sure. I mean, this is one of the areas in which we have to look really strategically about which argument will win over. And in the case of the Iraqi FGM, it did win over, and that was more for the public in trying to get those who believed that customarily they needed to cut because it was it was custom, and that it was, some people even believed it was religious obligation to do so, and therefore you needed a religious fatwa to actually say clearly this is not a religious practice. And then we had this grassroots NGO who went out and spread this, and that was actually helped really crack down on a lot of the rate of FGM. But beyond that, you get cases where, you know, where it doesn't always work. So for in Yemen, for instance, where we didn't use the Islamic argument, but an imam did, and he was an MP in the Yemeni parliament, and several years ago, they were debating raising the minimum age of marriage to 17. And he used the argument of Sharia law, and he said, you know, it should be higher. You know, this is an un-Islamic practice, and so on. And he really was making that argument as an imam himself. But it backfired on him. A far more right-wing man, a Salafi cleric in the same party that he's in, used it against him and said, actually, Sharia law, you know, it does allow for girls as young as 9 to get married, and you can't, if you legislate on this, you're actually making it un-Islamic, so we cannot legislate on this practice. And he used a very specific parliamentary technique to actually stall the law, and then that draft law was stuck since 2009. So, you know, we do end up in this kind of problems as well. Where do you go from there? So, I mean, we never used that argument, but we were able to sort of notice where it could be effective and where it might not work so well. And in the environment of Yemen, Sharia law was really being used by parliamentarians. In the actual practice itself, fathers were not marrying off young girls because they thought it was Islamically the right thing to do. They were marrying them off because they had debts that they needed to pay off because of other poverty reasons, or because they felt it meant that the girls would have a better life and so on. So the causes for that was not so much a customary religious tradition, but far more serious, and which meant that tackling it required looking at it in a more holistic and comprehensive manner. And then therefore we would look at it in that way. And the Imam himself has since changed his tactics. He's now moved on to a health angle. But we're sort of trying to convince him to look at it in a more holistic manner.
Any more questions? Yes.
Today we've heard a lot of stories from Uganda, Iraq, South Sudan. All of these are under developing countries and so-called the third world countries. I wanted to know how an advocacy group like Human Rights Watch would deal with problems of women from the privileged backgrounds. Recently there was a story which was widely covered on Channel 4 about the princesses from the Al Saud family, the ruling dynasty in Saudi Arabia, being mistreated. Now, you work with governments all the time. How difficult or easy is it for you to lobby the governments or put pressure on the governments to deal with extremely sensitive diplomatic hot potatoes? I mean, how would you expect an American, Barack Obama to go to Saudi Arabia and say, please stop mistreating your daughters? So it becomes extremely difficult for the governments as well. So how does HRW deal with such problems?
Sorry, we'll take more. Lady in the back.
Hi, thanks for a fascinating discussion. My name's Ellen Travers. I work with Girls Not Brides. I just wanted to thank colleagues at Human Rights Watch for really raising the visibility of child marriage on the international stage in a way that it hasn't been done before, and bringing to the fore the voices of the girls who have been affected. And I have two questions. One is that, what we're seeing is, a huge amount of attention, as was discussed already, an upcoming summit on the issue in July here, a Human Rights Council panel discussion in June. How do we make sure, and discussions around the post-2015 development framework and what that will look like for development goals that we set ahead. How do we make sure that there is some sort of accountability attached to these things? One thing that fascinated me when I visited a project of one of our members in Rajasthan in India, where there's a huge high prevalence rate of child marriage, was some of the kind of poster campaigns that they were doing, and putting literally the phone number of the law enforcement officer or a child protection officer who was responsible for implementing the law on the poster as a way of trying to do that. But at the same time, they're saying, well, when we create awareness about the law, it also drives it underground. So how do you tackle that challenge? And the second question was just a question on Yemen, and what you think has made the difference in progressing there. Was it civil society, the media, partnership, work with religious leaders, and what do you think are some of the lessons that we can learn for other countries from that?
One more lady.
Hi, this is to all the panel, but it might be more directed at anyone dealing with FGM. I just wondered, recently I think it was last night, the night before, there was BBC were covering the select committee on the FGM, and I was just wondering, most people's stance at the moment appears to be going down the education route, and I just wondered kind of whether you think that's a good form of implementation, given what you were saying about the cultural and the religious aspects that are coming into play, and whether, in terms of how you go about it, whether it's the correct way of attacking the situation.
I'm going to answer a part of your question, not the whole question, because I'll leave my colleagues to answer that. But Human Rights Watch doesn't document violations just in the Global South. So the Women's Rights Division, for example, most recently did work in Canada, looking at violence against Indigenous women, and both the neglect of violence against Indigenous women by the police, but also the police themselves as perpetrators of violence, particularly sexual violence against Indigenous women. So we really try to cover violations against, in my case, women's rights, but we have an entire program at Human Rights Watch that looks at North America. We produce more reports on the US than any other country. So, I mean, you're seeing a selection of work, but certainly not the totality of work, and we're very committed to two things. One is to covering human rights violations wherever they happen, and two, to make sure that our staff reflects the diversity of the regions we cover. And increasingly, we are basing people in the region, and we're employing people from those regions to do the work because we think they are more effective in doing that. So I just wanted to say that, we're certainly not going for the model of having kind of predominantly Western people telling predominantly people from the Global South what they're doing wrong. And I think Rothnna will probably talk about the specific case that you raised because she's worked upon that. And on the FGM question, I think that you need a comprehensive and holistic strategy. I mean, education is a critical part of it. You need law enforcement. You need education. You need a whole range of things. So there's not a magic bullet. There's not one single thing that is going to change it. And I think education is critical because I think very often, particularly the people that Agnes refers to as the people who are kind of invisible and left behind, don't have access to information about the health consequences of a practice like FGM. They don't understand why it has severe consequences for reproductive health in the long term. And they do believe often, very sincerely, that they're acting in the best interests of girls by doing something that is socially acceptable and important. So I think, a comprehensive and a deep strategy that reaches out to communities, that empowers law enforcement, that provides resources to teachers and healthcare workers and so on. In the long term, that's what's going to work.
Agnes, I don't know whether you want to come in on the FGM question, but certainly the child marriage with the summits, how do we, that's a really key point, the accountability, how do we stop these practices going underground? And
yeah. No, I mean, on the FGM, it's just what Liesl said. It really has to be comprehensive. I mean, earlier we were talking about it, actually, and I was telling you that in Kenya, where I come from, I have seen law enforcement having a difference where actually people are being prosecuted. The mutilators, the parents, the health workers, because sometimes, when you start shouting, then it goes underground and there's what we call the medicalization, then you get the health workers doing it. So definitely education is important, but also I think, using the law and enforcing it is critical. On the child marriage, the summits and all that, I mean, that's a tricky one. And I would also be interested to hear your views as my fellow colleague from Girls Not Brides. But I think the issue, as you say, is that, first of all, I think these summits are important because, I mean, it gives the issue a lot of visibility. The fact that, you know, governments are investing time to come and sit down and to talk and to dialogue, that itself we have to see it as something, as some progress. And our concern, just as you're asking, is then what happens after that? And that is why, for me, I think really advocacy at the national level is critical if we really have to move forward on a lot of these issues, because our leaders come to these meetings, they commit to a lot of things, but there's no accountability. Obviously, in terms of the summit that's going to come up, any outcome of that is not going to be binding. It's just government committing and saying this is what we can do. But if we use the example of the maternal health commitments that governments did through the, as part of the Every Woman, Every Child initiative, I have seen actually locally countries, NGOs, civil society, other activists holding governments accountable and saying, you committed to employing 5,000 nurses in the next 2 years, and so far we haven't seen anything. And they keep reminding the government, and you've seen governments including that in their strategies. Some of them are being implemented, others are not being implemented. So I think the accountability is for everyone of us really to take it upon ourselves and to use that to remind our governments, to embarrass them sometimes when they go to these international delegations and start making commitments. And I'll give an example. In Malawi, where we have been working, the president has made very many commitments, you know, internationally, nationally, that they were going to pass a marriage law that has been in the making for the last 8 years. Yet she has not done it. And every time she's given an international platform, she says the same thing, but she has not done it. So really, what does it mean? Should we then really continue giving her space to be telling us something that she's never going to do? You know, so it's that kind of, you know, embarrassment that I think sometimes we need to bring to our leaders. But again, those commitments, whether they are binding or not, I think they are useful. It's us as civil society sometimes to be strategic and smart in how we use them to make sure that they're implemented. I think actually Gauri should add.
That's perfect. I just want to add one thing. I mean, what's really important, I think, to say is that, you know, we see through the glass of these summits really easily. You know, it's great that there's attention on this issue. That's been the achievement of actually Girls Not Bride's network of hundreds of groups around the world, and we're part of that and proud to be. But as soon as you start scratching the surface, and we're seeing this in Geneva, for example, in negotiations around a Human Rights Council resolution, potentially, as soon as you start talking about what needs to be done to actually change it, most governments, of course, will agree it's a bad thing, child marriage. You know, there's very few, it's a bit, you know, it's a bit hard for governments these days to say, well, it's a great thing, child marriage, we should continue and stimulate it. But as soon as you start talking about what needs to happen, you need to criminalize marital rape. Well, that takes care of a couple of countries already. You need to make sure that sexual and reproductive rights are guaranteed. Well, that, you know, removes half of the countries. And so this is actually a very tough fight. Don't underestimate how hard this is. And as Agnes is saying, ultimately it's about changes at the national level. But we use these international moments to create deeper awareness of the issues, to hash out some of these problems that need to be, you know, fought over before we can get agreement globally, and to use that again to work at the local level to get these changes and pressure governments into setting up a system that's respectful for women's rights.
I'll just pick up on from the child marriage point onto Yemen. So, I mean, I think it's all about timing and opportunity. I mean, you could be doing a lot of work and putting a lot of pressure on and continue to doing this for a long term, but, you know, you just wait for those tiny little moments in time where that one big case, that one little moment, and you drive it forward. So, you know, what happened really, I mean, we just ended up in a situation where we did have a draft law in Parliament that, you know, was stalled, nothing was happening with it. We still had cases of child marriage coming out, but nothing was really happening. Then you had the uprising. Then you had this transitional government. We went back in again. We issued this report. And then there was this moment of the national dialogue where we had, okay, here's an opportunity. And we went right into it again. And then we had a horrible case of Rawan, who died at the age of 8, a few days after a wedding. And that is not the first case of a girl dying after her wedding night. It's not the very first, and it may not be the last, depending on how things go. But it did something slightly different to what it's done before. The government responded by going out of its way to deny that it happened. They went down to the province, they found the local official found a man and a little girl and said, this is Rawan and this is her father, and this was not true. Except we had spoken to some medical, health workers who had said actually a little girl had died by the name of Rawan. And this was one little town which was known for trafficking of girls and everything. It was a very poor town, but it was one of those little border towns where these things seemed to be taking place. So the response by the government seemed to show that they were really not only trying to hide it from the international world, but actually locally they were trying to really push it all the way back down again. They were very embarrassed by the story. And we really used that story to sort of go out and say, we do not want to see any more Rawans. If this was true or not, the fact is that this is an ongoing issue. Whether or not a young girl is dying, frankly, there were girls being married on an everyday basis, and they were suffering from several different types of harmful consequences. And then, we had that national dialogue recommendation that really came through because of a lot of lobbying, but also partly because, they had a 30% quota in there. They had a woman leading the Rights and Freedoms Committee who was able to argue not just with the men in the committee, but with the women themselves. She was fighting, for instance, with a medical doctor, a woman who was saying, no, a girl can be married at the age of 16, it's completely fine. And when she talked to her about the medical aspect, she said, I'm a doctor, she's completely fine to get married. So, there were tough moments even there where having the women themselves at the grassroots level empowered and in a political and powerful process means that you can get them and support them to have those arguments to be able to push through. And now we're at that moment where, we actually have a Child Rights Act. We're still not at the end point yet. We still don't even have a law, which is not even the end point, it's the beginning of everything. So we know that the law is not going to get there, but to even just get there for Yemen is a big deal. So we're still pushing. And one of the other big aspects that I haven't mentioned is the international community. We also got, for instance, Yemen is one of those countries that gets a lot of aid because it's one of the poorest countries in the region, and it's one of the most unstable countries in the region, and it's where Al-Qaeda is sort of based, and so like the UK, the US, they're all interested in Al-Qaeda. They don't want it to be an unstable country, so they put a lot of money in there. And they have this thing called the Friends of Yemen. So they are interested, and we've managed to push them into sort of talking about human rights issues, and then we managed to push them into talking about child marriage. So we got them at the Human Rights Council to issue a resolution where they would have done anywhere in Yemen, but to talk specifically about ending child marriage, which was great. So we've been having international community really adding and piling on that pressure, and that concerted effort has really pushed the government to not be able to backtrack on some of the issues and to move it forward. But that fight very much still goes on.
I think Yemen is one of the countries that signed up to the William Hague's Declaration on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. Do you think by having these kind of summits and getting signatures, you can actually leverage that from a domestic point of view? By saying you've signed up to this conflict situation, what about we haven't got domestic laws at home? Is that a way of leveraging for you?
That's pretty much exactly what we do. So people talk about human rights being Western or cultural, and at the end of the day, these states are signing up to these treaties and to these conventions and to the summits, and all we're doing is holding them to account. And it's what local activists get to do. So it's not just us. Everyone gets to say, this is what you promised, and you have not come through on it. You really need to be pushing that through.
We monitor everything they say on radio, on TV. Exactly. We try to, as Rosna is saying, we try to look for every single moment, every opportunity to just remind them.
That's good. Great. Should I just answer the Saudi question?
Yes, please. Sorry. Yes.
So I've worked on Saudi Arabia for years before I even worked at Human Rights Watch, and I can tell you it's one of the most difficult countries to work on. Not just because it's one of the most powerful countries in the world. It's not part of the West, but it has an incredible amount of power. But it's also one where we have very little access to. And women there, as you know, they live under a guardianship system which affects both the very rich, like if you're a princess, and the very, very poor. And that princess story really just eclipsed that, because people don't realize it doesn't matter how wealthy you are. If you're a woman in Saudi Arabia, you're screwed. So, it's, like domestic workers, or people who are at the mercy of someone. If the legal system, the regulatory system, binds you to someone and says those decisions that you should be able to make because you're a grown woman is actually taken by somebody else, and somebody else has that control over you, they may abuse that position. There may be men who are very nice, and you might be lucky and have that wonderful husband who lets you do what you want, but frankly, you shouldn't have to be in a position to ever have to ask your husband if you can leave the country, if you can go study, do a PhD, or if you can even work. But right now, Saudi Arabia is in that situation where, you know, we still have a very discriminatory guardianship system still in place. And for instance, working on other countries, talking to Saudi Arabia, it is incredibly difficult. It's very hard trying to get any other country talking about Saudi Arabia to Saudi Arabia in any public forum. And you know, we've worked. You know, diplomats will say that they're doing so in closed meetings, especially the US. They will always say, you know, we talk about human rights issues, yeah, it's behind closed doors, and it's like, yes, women's rights are always going to be behind closed doors at the end of the day. But then you'll get these moments, you know, and you have to get, for instance, we managed to get, and we had an MP in the House of Commons stand up and ask about the Saudi princess story to David Cameron. And I've never actually seen a question on Saudi Arabia on human rights issues being asked in a Prime Minister question time in the UK. So that's a first. And that's on a women's rights issue. So, you know, getting people holding their own governments to account for what's happening in Saudi Arabia on women or human rights, other human rights issues is a very big deal.
Can you also tell us how Cameron responded to it?
He said that he would look into it. Okay. So the response wasn't great, but the fact that the question was asked in the House of Commons, yeah. Our standards are quite low.
Any more questions? We've got, yes.
My questions are quite simple. I think we're all probably here because these issues are important to us, whether they affect us directly or not. And there seem to be a lot of people here that are involved in schemes that are making waves already. But for those of us who aren't, is there any way we can get involved apart from sending money to a charity and it going to an abyss? How can we directly, and I'm talking about maybe even going over to these countries that are in these situations, being involved in schemes that can make a difference directly to individuals, because that's what I'm really interested in.
Any other questions? Yes.
The back.
I just wanted to ask about Nigeria. I just wondered what you thought the reason for the delay in anything happening is, whether it's because the government were trying to see what Boko Haram were going to do, whether they're going to show their hand, or because violence against anybody, girls or boys or grown-ups, is fairly common in Nigeria, or whether it is the pressure of the Bring Back Our Girls movement that has suddenly got them to start moving on this.
So Boko Haram, Liesl, do you want to?
You know, I think if you take one message from this panel, it should be that change is local. And I think the most important thing that anybody can do is work in their own communities. Because I think all of us on this panel started working on communities at home. So I think there are many issues in this country often that strike me as really important and neglected. So when I look to recruit somebody at Human Rights Watch to work in my division, something that I always look for are people who've worked locally, who've worked in the local rape crisis center, who have worked on domestic issues in their own country, because I think two things. One is I think that it adds a richness to your ability to advocate internationally. You are more strategic, you have a better sense of what works, and you are much more connected to the issues. I'm never in favor of people who finish university and then go and work at the UN, because I think you really don't have a clear sense of what the real world is like. So the other thing that I think is important is that it really creates a community of activists that you're a part of, because, you know, there's no real community of international activists. We're all connected to the people that we work with in the countries that we work on or we live in. And I think that, again, adds a richness to your advocacy. So I think, you know, whatever is going on around in your neighborhood, that's a really good place to start.
I just wanted to add to that, because I just want to make a shameless plug that, you know, on the UK, I mean, one of the first things that I worked on was on asylum seekers in the United Kingdom, how female asylum seekers are treated, for example. I mean, it's just to give you one example, which, it was a priority for Human Rights Watch. It also answers part of the other question of do we work on countries like the UK. I mean, there's many issues. Like I said, domestic violence, some of the groups that are still left out. Prosecution rates of domestic violence are so low still. I mean, we can go on, but there are so many issues here. I just want to fully agree with what Liesl says, and I think it's so important to work in your own community on these types of issues. And please hold the UK to account for issues that the UK is doing abroad as well. But it starts here, and I just want to add to that. I agree.
And so probably finally on Nigeria?
Yeah, on Nigeria. Okay. Today we went to a meeting, and Gary was asked a question, and she said, I don't know. And she was like, is it bad to say I don't know? I said, I wish my government would learn to say I don't know when they don't know what to do, other than giving answers that are not useful. I think the Nigerian government, the lack of response, I think, is not really surprising. They really have not had any strategy on how to respond to the Boko Haram problem, and the failure to really respond, very quickly and proactively to the kidnapping of these girls just points to what it thinks about women generally, how essentially they respond to other women's rights problems. But a bigger issue for me, other than, is just, government systems and structures that are not functional. That's the short answer, I think.
I think that is probably all we have got time for tonight. So I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Lots of interesting things that have come out. Probably the sticking point has been it's a long match. It's the long game, and it's baby steps. But amazing things can happen during that process. So I'd like to thank the panelists. We have Agnes, for Gary, for Liesl, to Rosna and Saba. Just thank you very much for sharing your experiences. So give them a round of applause. Over here if you want to come and help yourselves, and I'm sure the panelists will be around for a little bit if you wanted to grab any of them.
That's good.